Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in, and on this channel I share stories that will educate, inform and inspire to help you live a life of significance. Now, last week we heard from Dr. James Densley, a Brit living in America, professor, criminologist, TEDx speaker, writer for places like The Guardian, LA Times, and co-founder of the Violence Project. Now, he shared his path to becoming an internationally known expert on mass violence, and in this video we're going to focus on how James finds identity in being a British American and what that transition looks like making his new life here in America. But before we get into the video, if you get value from the content, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to be notified every time I release a new and inspiring video. So let's dive into this week's conversation with Dr. James Densley. So Dr. James Densley, thank you for joining me again.
Pleasure.
And I know, James, in part one, we discussed about your PhD, your sort of love of street gangs and how you became a sort of national and international expert. So if people haven't listened, they should go back and do that. But I want to dive in now about you being another Brit here in America, but where you've changed. You're now British American. If I look at your Wikipedia, it says British American on there.
Yeah, I did. I actually I did my citizenship application and everything else in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, and I'm going to be honest, like I was very concerned at the time about the implications of a Donald Trump presidency for what it would mean as somebody who's a green card holder. Yeah. And I just decided I think I need to actually get my citizenship just in case, the wheels fall off effectively. Yeah. And so I did. So yes, I now have the dual nationality in that regard. Yeah. And
it's interesting because I've got to go through the process. My green card expires next October. So hopefully there's no one listening from Immigration Customs Enforcement here
but they'll be banging down the door.
They will sign countdown. So I'm going to go through the process as well. And it's interesting because someone said to me, a friend said, do you feel anything after being here for 9 years? I said, I am very grateful for the opportunities that America has given me. But I am, similar to where you were just going, I am very aware that even being black in English, there's differences that being English brings you. When I went through my application, I had to go to the American embassy in London. I get there with my papers and someone's behind the big glass and I'm thinking, how's this going to go? What questions are going to ask me? Yeah, and we sit down in the room and have the conversation. And the guy said, so where are you going again? I said, Minnesota. He said, let me think. Do I know anyone in Minnesota that might be able to give you a job? And that was my immigration interview to get my green card. And I've got to be a little bit biased here. Would that be the same, James, if I was a Somalian, Nigerian, someone from the Middle East? My mind says maybe probably not. And I think I'm allowed that bias, I think. But it's being English is very different. So I think even you being fearful of Donald Trump, I think we're from the right country to have some stability here.
I think you're exactly right. And to the extent where when I very first moved to the United States, I lived in New York for 3 years. I then went back to the UK for 3 years, finished my PhD, and then I've lived in Minnesota for 10. And I remember, particularly when I was very first, back in those days, I was a bit younger and I had some hair and I was a bit fitter and everything else as well. And you'd open your mouth anywhere, grocery store, the bar, just in public, and immediately people are like, oh my God, it's a British accent, and they were like almost mesmerized, and it was almost like a Jedi mind trick. I could say anything and they'd believe it. Yeah. And there was a real power to the British identity in the United States. There's a sort of cultural fascination, and you see it throughout popular culture. Americans love Downton Abbey and they love British dramas and everything else. And so you kind of play into a little bit of that stereotype, if I'm honest. Yeah. And in many ways, it works to your advantage. And it becomes a privilege that you have to be very mindful of. But at the same time, it does benefit you in the United States, which is, I agree with you, which is totally different to the vast majority of people who do immigrate to this country and experience so much racism, so many barriers to their success moving forward. And so it is weird in that regard of thinking of myself as an immigrant living in the United States and yet not really experiencing many of the downsides that come with that designation. So it's a radical change.
And it's interesting you say it, because even for me being a black guy, I can feel, people use the term white privilege, whatever it is, and I think most of my listeners would know part of my background. I don't necessarily really buy into that, because I wouldn't say that I've experienced or seen white privilege. But I've definitely felt privileged because of being English.
Yes.
I have been stopped by the police, and perhaps I haven't conformed to their stereotype and have heard me talk, and instantly it's changed their opinion.
That's it.
My good friend Tina Rowe in Colorado that you've met, she always says, well, Simon, you're black, you got an English accent, it's like a royal flush in cards. People all instantly think that you're intelligent just because you're here and you've done these things. So I mean, it is. I definitely do feel privileged because of my my nationality as being English.
And it's strange to think of that, because usually in the circumstances of being an immigrant, there's a different perception in many ways. I mean, I remember, and this will sound real like privilege, right? But I remember before having a conversation with people about immigration. It was in a class, actually. It was a scholarly conversation. There were professors and everything else there, and they were sort of talking a lot about the burden of immigration and all this type of stuff. And someone was saying, people are coming up through the borders and these caravans and all this type of stuff. And I said, I arrived in the UK on business class. Like, the conception of immigration in this country is totally broken. But we put people into these neat little boxes, and we say, like, well, this is how Latino people must think, and this is how immigrants must think. But you don't really understand the diversity of the population in the United States and the different experiences that they have. And I think, in this regard, being British, I think, has ended up being kind of a privilege, but also an advantage, I think, professionally and personally, I think, in the United States. And then weirdly, when I think about from a professional standpoint, how it's also benefited me, it's more than just, you have an accent and these types and the stereotypes associated with it, but it's enabled me to, in my professional world, sort of have expertise that transcends borders and everything else. So take gangs as an example. My research is both in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And so automatically you have this interesting comparative perspective that you're bringing to all the conversations that you're coming at that maybe a lot of other people don't have. And so that in turn feeds into opportunities where you get to speak at conferences or you get invited to participate in certain things, because they're looking for a global perspective on something, a comparative perspective on something that's going to be able to interpret events in the United States from a different lens, to say, well, how do you interpret, for example, policing, gun laws, you name it? How do you interpret those things as a Brit in the United States? Do you see things differently? I think that in a professional sense also gives you a little bit of an advantage and different perspective.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've also seen part of that. I mean, my eldest son, a couple of weeks ago, said, Dad, how many countries have you been to? I said, I don't know, maybe 25, 30. And he said, well, can you say them? I said, well, get a pen and paper and let's try and write them down.
Yeah,
and I didn't. I can't remember what the number is. It's somewhere between 20 and 30. But again, even doing that is experience that others might not necessarily have had here in America. So it does change my perspective and my view as to either how I talk, how I articulate key points, or just my knowledge and understanding. Because it comes down to a good point that you raised about, we assume that everyone that arrives here is either on a boat somewhere, they've got one suitcase and no money.
Yes.
Well, as you say, I mean, people are coming here. I owned multiple houses when I immigrated here. You arrived in first class. We're not all immigrants are poor, but there is this stereotype that can come with it. It's not often seen as to what do those immigrants have to offer the US to a small minority, But changing the subject then, James, before we really go down a rabbit hole and get ourselves into a political conversation. But what about what you had to leave behind in the UK? So you, like me, have an American wife. You've now got sort of, two sons. We're like Ebony and Ivory, really.
We are.
American wives, two sons, similar age. We really are. It's like separated at birth. But so how was it for you then moving here? In your 20s, I guess you would have been, late 20s. Yeah. Friends, family, to start again. How was that for you?
Yeah, I guess that's the hardest thing. And I think that's true then of any immigrant, I think, who has to start over and move again. That is the hardest thing, being separated from family, parents. I've got my sister who lives in the UK as well. Your closest friends, the people that you grew up with. And it's weird. Like, the world is smaller in so many ways than it ever has been, right? I mean, I remember when I was very first just dating my now wife, and for a little bit of a period of time, we were long distance between the UK and the United States. And I remember I had to buy a phone card to call her, and it was costing me, £1 a minute to have a conversation with someone in the United States. Nowadays, we've got FaceTime and Facebook and Skype and Zoom, and you can communicate across the world, and it makes it a lot easier. But even that being said, it's hard. It's hard not being able to see your friends and family when you want to see them. At the moment with COVID, it's been hard to not be able to see my mom. I lost my dad this year. He passed away this year. That was really hard, to be 4,000 miles away when you get that news from your family. I mean, it's devastating. And although I was there within 24 hours, thanks to the modern technology like airplanes, not being there day in, day out is difficult. And so there are things that you do miss, mostly people, I think, is the biggest thing. And then also just silly cultural things that you miss as well. Like, you miss the banter that you might get in the pub around, your favorite football, soccer team, and things like that. And some of the food and those aspects. You're always going to miss those comforts of home, I think.
So, James, one of the things that I found from living here was that, I was a police officer, served the Queen ultimately, and was proud to be English. But I didn't realise how patriotic I was until I came to America. That someone mentioned something about the Queen or William. Oh no, you can't say that. How dare you? So I think my patriotism got stronger the further I was away from England. I don't know. Have you got any experiences like that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think for me, it's almost like the classic, like, you don't know what you've got till it's gone scenario. And yes, you do. And also, you don't realise just who you are until you're taken out of that context. For me, at least, I think that's the biggest thing, is when you are like everybody else. So when I go back to the UK now, I'm just another British guy with a British accent with all the other British people, right? And so you don't see how different you are until you're taken out of that context. And I think it was being taken out of that context that then got me thinking, like, wow, I didn't realize quite how British I was. That some of the values I had, or some of the viewpoints that I had, or some of the things that I thought and believed. And yeah, in a weird way, I think you're right. You do get an element of sort of patriotism or something like that kind of speaks to that idea that you are seeing yourself as separate from that country, and then you feel sort of protective over it at the same time.
And then what about your sons? I mean, I know with my two sons, I was consulting for an organisation, and it was they had an issue surrounding discrimination. Someone had felt they had been discriminated against a sort of a security process, and because I sort of represent the organisation, I said, well, can you meet the person who's making a complaint against us? Because, you built the programme, you trained the programme, can you explain it? And I sort of met this person. I was saying about, it wasn't nothing to do with your ethnicity. It was just, you fell victim to this programme because of a set of behaviours. And this guy, he really took the conversation in different directions about race and ethnicity and do you know the difference and all this type of stuff. And just by chance, my wife was going to collect me from this meeting, and she had my two sons with me, and there was a coffee shop in this place. And so my sons came in, and I could see them, and I wanted to take the question from them. I said, well, look, my dad is Nigerian, my mum is white English, I consider myself British, I'm living in America. My wife is American. My eldest son was born in the UK, now lives here in the US. My youngest son was born in the US. And so they sort of come over, and I asked him the question and said, so where are we from? And he sort of looked at me a bit strange and said, well, ask my youngest where he's from. And do you know what he said, James? He's born here in America. Do you know where he said he's from?
Where did he say?
I'm from England.
Did he
and then
really?
I then said, ask the oldest where he's from, and then he was born in the UK. He said, I'm American. So I said, we look at all these things. The question is, what is our identity, and who are we as our individuals where, they've got black, white, different sort of geographical locations. I mean, I sort of tee up that example because do you find it difficult with your two sons to maintain any type of sort of English heritage or understanding?
Yeah, that actually,
and that's a complex way to get there.
It is
but I want to throw it out
it's
there.
funny, but you say it's a complex way to get there. Maybe the listeners are thinking that was a complex way to get there. I perfectly understand you though, because I've got a very similar situation, which is my oldest son, who's 10 years old now. He was born in London in the UK. My youngest son, who's 4 years old, was born right here in Minnesota. And so when my oldest son is asked, a little bit different flip to your kids, whenever we're on vacation or wherever, somebody asks him, like, where are you from? He says, oh, I'm from London. But he says it in an American accent because he's spent 10 years of his life here. And people look at him like he's got two heads. They're like, wait a minute, you're speaking with an American accent, but you say you're from London. What does that mean? My youngest, on the other hand, born here in Minnesota, really identifies as an American. And it's very different. And not only that, to really confuse matters more, my wife is part Japanese, part Dutch, so, and at times, really, if you look at her, you'd think that she was Hispanic, is actually more of how she appears. Right. So we also confuse people in terms of like what our identity structures are and everything else as well. And I think what's interesting is my oldest son really has embraced his UK side. He's all about soccer. He's a huge soccer fan. So, he supports a team in the UK, follows that almost religiously. And I think that has been his kind of way of saying culturally connected to the United Kingdom through sport, essentially, has been one of the ways that he's done that. And then, through trips back home, through family connections, weekend FaceTime calls with family and stuff like that, we've been able to keep some of those British traditions and things alive. And we drink a lot of tea in our house, which is very cliche. We love a Sunday roast dinner. All these types of things, which are very British, and we continue to incorporate them in our lives. At the same time, we also eat a lot of rice in our house, and sushi and things like that because of the Japanese side of the family. And so we do try and embrace all these different sort of cultural aspects as we develop that identity.
Yeah, it's going. Like I said, I took us round a big path to get there, but
it's very similar.
Well, yeah, because I wanted to tee it up for now you're a British American. I mean, what is your identity now? What would you say? How would you try and categorize it then? Now you're a British American.
Yeah,
but we're getting deep here for the listeners.
It's like
it's difficult. And I didn't give James this question. I should say that as well. I've thrown that in there. He has no idea.
No, I have literally no idea. No, it's, I think of myself as being British American, if I'm honest. Like, I do think, I know deep down I'm very British in America. And I think in that regard, I would maybe lean toward that. But the American part of me is really quite strong now. I mean, I've lived in this country for 13 of the last 16 years. I was married in this country. I married an American. And I've worked most of my professional life in the United States. And so you can't help but feeling, an attachment to the country, and also quite grateful for the opportunities that have been afforded me in this country. And to put that into context, doing a PhD sounds really fancy, right? It's Dr. Densley.
Yeah.
When you say it on a podcast and people are thinking, all that privilege there. Doing graduate school sucks is really the bottom line, right? It's 4 or 5 years of your life that the whole time you're questioning why the hell you're ever doing it. And you're really questioning the likelihood, are you ever going to get a job? And when I moved to the US, I was very, very lucky to land a tenure track position at a university that I've been able to work my way through the ranks to become a full professor. And I do look at that and think, would I have had that same opportunity if I had stayed in the UK? Would I have been as lucky to have those opportunities? And would have some of the things that have come my way subsequently have happened had I not been in the United States? And so, there's definitely aspects of America that make you realize it's important to be here, and it's sort of shaped my trajectory. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and actually there was a guy, Wasim Debussy, I think his name is, an Australian guy, really interesting background. I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. That podcast hasn't aired as yet. I think he'll air just before you. But he is born in Lebanon, moved to Australia when he was 9, 10, I think, from memory. Grew up in Australia, would go back to Lebanon. They're like, well, you're not Lebanese. And they're like, well, yeah, I am. I was born here. And then in Australia, Australians would say to him, you're not Australian, you're Lebanese. So he was sort of trapped between these two cultures. And I can sort of relate to that a little bit, because even for us, as people are sort of, like you say, working class, sort of move to middle class, I go back and even sometimes my friends joke to me and say, you said party. I'm like, no, I didn't. I said party. They said, no, you said party.
Yeah,
I'm like,
water.
Yeah. And
you said water. And it's like, no, it's water.
Yeah, so you don't realise these things. You can get trapped between two cultures.
Yeah, the language, the accent and the language thing is really true. I mean, I know for a fact my accent has dramatically softened since coming into the United States. And I now almost at times sound Australian, because I've created this sort of hybrid of a British and American accent, and for whatever reason that has happened. But when I go back home now, people look at me like, is this guy American, Australian? Yeah. Is he British? And then it takes about a week, and then all of a sudden it comes back, and then all of a sudden the accent's much stronger again, and I sound like me again. It's funny that those things happen. The accent one for me is one that I think I tried at first almost like fight back against some of the Americanisms, So I would say, no, it's football, not soccer, and it's the pavement, not the sidewalk, and this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm a professor, and my job is to make sure I'm easily understood from my students and clients and other fellow professors and everything else. And I found I was fighting an uphill battle, which instead it made me realize like I had to become effectively bilingual. You have to speak English and you have to speak American English, and I now navigate those two worlds in that way. And a lot of it, I think, at the softening of my accent was, if I'm going to be talking all day on a stage as a professor, as a teacher, I've got to make sure people can understand what I'm saying. And so I ended up with this sort of hybrid. But then when I go back home, people look at me and like, what's wrong with this guy?
Yeah.
It's funny.
And it's funny because I sometimes do that when I present. I normally stop after a few minutes, okay, how are we doing on the accent check? Because obviously, I mean, you're from Leicester, but you sound more posh. I'm just like working class stuff. But it's funny, and I do that sort of accent check, but I do find myself talking slower when I'm presenting so people can understand as well. It's almost like when someone's being sort of rude to a deaf person, when they're talking really slowly to them, assuming they can't understand them and stuff. Yeah, fascinating. So let's move on. So that's sort of a bit about England, but I want to just ask a question about you as to where you are now. So what were you most challenged about then from making a transition from one country to the next?
I would say the biggest transition, I think, is you're trying to kind of establish, but at the same time almost reinvent yourself. And there's pros and cons to that, right? I actually think in some ways it maybe worked to my advantage that you were an unknown entity, so that you could, basically my life in the United States begins effectively with, being Dr. Densley and being, a PhD graduate. So a lot of the stuff that comes before that doesn't necessarily exist in the US context. So from a professional standpoint, that might be advantageous, where you sort of, you're this blank slate and you sort of build yourself from there, whereas you don't have maybe some of the baggage that you might have from the UK. So in some ways, I think that was maybe an advantage. But the other thing that I think I've really tried to do in the US in recent years is there is a risk that you can kind of get pigeonholed as, well, you're a gang expert, but you only really studied them in London, so you don't really know anything about what's going on here because America's different. Yeah. So I really tried to take steps to educate myself about what was going on in the United States context. And in so doing, you start to diversify your expertise. I'll give you an example. In London, the vast majority of street violence is with knives. In the United States, it's with guns. Yeah. So once you start doing a little bit of research with gangs in the United States, you start to realize, okay, this gun issue is a big one. And it's a rabbit hole that you can go down real quickly, but you have to then educate yourself on the Second Amendment and what it means for the American people. And you have to educate yourself on all the myriad issues that are associated with gun violence. Well, fast forward a few years, and before you know it, that expertise in knife crime and gangs in the UK has evolved into an expertise in gun violence and youth violence in the United States. And that then becomes another building block that you can start to add to your repertoire to expand your research agenda. So you don't just get pigeonholed as like, well, James was the guy that knows a little bit about gangs in London. It's now that James actually knows some things about these other aspects as well. By broadening that out, you get greater opportunities, I think, to move forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know one of your articles, hopefully I got the right one, James, but it says one went viral was it in the LA Times?
That's right.
LA
yes.
Times, all mass shooters have 4 things in common, I think. Do you put that down? Is that something that you learned here in the US, or do you think you would have been like that in the UK? Sort of being that chameleon, being able to sort of diversify into, change different colours, just sort of reinvent yourself. Is that part of a key to your success now? And I do want to touch on the Violence Project before we close. So
yeah,
what would you say about that?
I think it is. I think it is. And the reason for that is I think it would have been very easy and very comfortable to continue down the same path if I was in the UK. So you've built that network of trusted contacts on the streets of London, and then think, okay, well, I've written my first book on gangs in London. I'll now do a follow-up on gangs in London. And there'll be a third book on gangs in London.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you're the gangs in London guy. Well, I couldn't do that. I moved to the Twin Cities, and all of a sudden I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
And I had to rebuild those relationships. And actually what you realize is the research questions are different in the Twin Cities that they were in London. And so you end up going down these different paths. And you mentioned the op-ed we wrote. That is obviously an extension of the work we're doing at the moment on mass shooters. That is a trajectory change. Collaborating with Gillian Peterson, a psychologist, and myself a sociologist by background, we just were getting frustrated with the cycle of the news, which was there was a mass shooting and no one had a good explanation for it. And Jill came to me one day and said, hey, you've studied gun violence, you've studied violence, right? Could we apply some of that to understanding something like mass shootings? And I said, well, it's a bit of an extension, but I think we could figure it out. And over time, that work has evolved to the point where, we were interviewing mass shooters in prison. We have been interviewing the families of victims, survivors, parents of mass shooters. Again, you can talk to gang members on the street. You know this, you're a cop.
Yeah.
If you can interview gang members on the street, it's not that far removed to be able to then interview people in their homes and in different contexts. And so as long as you've got those transferable skills, they transfer. And that's, I think, what I've been trying to do over the last few years is really broaden the horizon to be asking similar questions, but just in sort of related contexts.
Yeah, and James, it's been, over our 2-part conversation, it's been great to get to know you a bit better. And for me to ask you questions as a friend just in a bar having a happy hour, I might not necessarily ask you. So it's been, really grateful for you taking the time to talk to me. And in relation to the Violence Project, I know your own personal website is jamesdensley.com. How can people learn more about your research into mass shootings?
Yeah, so that is theviolenceproject.org. And what we've got on there is a database of anyone who's killed 4 or more people in a public space in the United States. And it's their psychosocial life histories. We've got about 160 variables about all aspects of their life, how they got their guns, how they grew up, mental health challenges, everything's in there. And then we've got a book coming out next year called The Violence Project. That'll be on bookshelves next year.
And you're starting to work towards online learning as well. I hope you haven't given away too many
surprise.
secrets there, but surprise. I can cut it out if we...
No, not at all. No, yes, you're right. We're calling it off-ramps. Yeah. And it is a spin-off for the work we've been doing on mass shootings. What we've identified is, in our research, we think there are tangible intervention points on the pathway to violence. And what we want to try and do is make that research accessible to the broadest possible audience. And so we want to do a little bit of sort of interactive video content, some lesson plans, things that teachers, social workers, police officers can interact with. And so we're working on that at the moment, and that hopefully will launch again next year, 2021.
Yeah, well, James, you're doing some fantastic work in some many different difficult and challenging areas. So thank you for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast. To help spread this inspiring story, be sure to share it with your friends, hit the like button, and of course subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on any future episodes. We'd also love to hear how this story impacted you, so leave a comment on whatever platform you're watching us from. To learn more about this episode, our guests, or Simon, head over to the Simon Osimo /podcast and sign up to receive the latest information delivered straight to your inbox. Once again, thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast.